This episode of The Orb is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 150,000 titles for your desktop or mobile device. To get a free audiobook of your choice, visit audibletrial.com/Trek.fm. Also, help us keep Star Trek discussion coming to you each day by becoming a Trek.fm patron through Patreon. Get access to exclusive content and become part of the team. You'll find all the details at patreon.com/TrekFM. That's patreon.com/TrekFM.
This is J.G. Hertzler, General Martok on Deep Space Nine, and you're listening to Trek.fm.
Welcome, Niners, to another episode of The Orb, our dedicated Deep Space Nine show. I'm Christopher Jones, and with me, as he always is my esteemed co-host, Matthew Rushing, who is coming to us today from the future. Or the past. I'm not really sure. Matthew, I hate temporal mechanics.
Chris, are we in the is what's happening now, or are we then, or I don't know. What's going on now?
Matthew, hold on a second. Let me press a button here. Okay, look at your screen. You see this?
Yeah.
This is happening now.
So this is now.
This is now.
What was that?
That was then.
But this is... So that was... Okay, never mind, Chris. Gosh. Whew, man.
Matthew, I think what we really need is the Orb of Time.
Chris, can you please procure that for me from the emissary? That would be great, because there's this moment I've really been wanting to go back and relive. So, yeah, let's do that.
Yeah. Well, hold on, Matthew. Hold on a second. Going back to our last episode, I need to consult emissary.com.
Oh, gosh. To make your appointment for the Orb of Time?
Yes. Matthew, I'm going to put us down for 2. Do we want the course meal that includes the spring wine, or are we going to go with something else here?
Yeah, as long as they don't give me the Bajoran chicken meal, I want the fish.
Okay, you want the fish, yes. And I believe also, as we discussed on a previous episode, room service does include a Jamja stick on your pillow.
Well, as long as somebody comes in and fluffs my pillow, I'm fine.
All right, so we're going to talk about the Orb of Time today. On our last episode, we talked about Kira Maru and wrongs darker than death or night, and that story is facilitated by the Orb of Time, which is a mechanism that the DS9 writers used only twice, in that episode and in Trials and Tribble-ations. And the question is, well, there are a couple of questions. One is, why do you use the Orb of Time to facilitate time travel in Deep Space Nine? And in other cases, you use some other mechanism like tachyon particles building up on the hull of the ship or something like that. What is it about the Orb of Time that makes it the right device for storytelling in certain situations?
I think what was so wonderful about this contraption that they had created was they had given themselves a simple, easy way to say that you could go back in time. They could change the parameters based on kind of what they needed without having to do a lot of explanation. And very little technobabble. Pretty much it was the Orb of Time. That's the answer. And that, in its connection with the prophets who are outside of space and time, and how all that could work, answered every question instead of having to be like, oh, the tachyons are building up because of the nebulic pressure of the comedy fragment coming in at an angle of 45 I mean, yeah, that all just it takes too much time to figure out that, and we just don't have the time to do that. So I think Deep Space Nine...
We don't have the time, Matthew.
Exactly. Deep Space Nine, it really didn't... It didn't do tons of insane technobabble. And, when you figured out a very simple way to be able to get characters back to the previous place in history, why not use that instead? Deep Space Nine doesn't do a lot of time travel anyway. The only other episode that I'm really thinking of is Past Tense, and then, of course, Children of Time, and then these two that we're talking about now.
Yeah.
So,
well, there are a few other time travel stories in Deep Space Nine, and in most cases, they use some technical explanation for how the characters or the ships are thrown back in time, but they don't dwell on it. It's not a big part of the story. It happens, and then they tell the story. In the case of Wrongs Darker Than Death or Night, I think that the use of the Orb of Time works well for the two reasons. One is that the story is about Bajorans, Kira Nerys, Kira Maru, and the Orb of Time is a Bajoran artifact. And so it makes sense that Kira Nerys, with her spirituality, would go to the orb to find the answers that she's looking for. What's really interesting in that episode is that she goes there. They don't spend a bunch of time talking to the monks. We just see her go in. We see the orb there. She opens the doors, and instantly she's there in those caves. And that's it. Then at the end, and this is something I want to talk about later, after she saves her mother and Dukat from the bomb, she's back on Bajor, which makes me wonder what the Orb of Time actually does, and we'll talk about that later. But in terms of this one story, do you agree that even if there had been a scientific, technical explanation, even if it weren't dwelled upon, would that have harmed the type of story that they wanted to tell that was so emotional and so focused in on these two characters?
I think so. What you need for this is a controlled way to go back without being able to mess up the timeline. And as Kira says to Cisco in Wrongs Darker Than Death or Night, the prophets will be guiding me. They're not going to let anything harm the timeline. And I think that's an interesting thing about specifically that use of the Orb of Time, is that they have figured out how to use it. If we remember the first time that this happens, it's an accident that they go back. But
that's in Trials and Tribble-ations.
Right, exactly. And well, it's not really an accident. They're caused to go back by...
Well, they were transporting... In that story, they were transporting the Orb of Time back to Bajor. So they didn't really know much about it.
Exactly. So, but this time, specifically, they've been able, I guess, to find from use of and understanding of, and maybe through study, and even, who knows, from what the prophets that they've gathered, the ways in which to use this that allows people, and certain people at certain times, to travel back and experience events that are important to them if the prophets deem that worthy. And so I think that's a really interesting thing. So for this story, yes, I think it would have been harmed if there needed to be some sort of like slingshot maneuver around a sun to get Kira back in time. I mean, no, because this is as much a spiritual journey as it is anything else for Kira, because it's going to have a deep impact on her soul, what she's going to find out about her mother and Dukat, and what she thinks about, collaborators and all that stuff. So, yeah, this gives them the opportunity to tell that story. And I think, when you jump to Trials and Tribble-ations, it gives them a way to tell that story without having to have anything other than this magic box. That's an easy way. You've already set it up in the series that these things do weird things we've talked about. So I just think it's so cool. And I honestly just kind of wish it had been utilized maybe one or two more times in the series, because I think it would have been fascinating, some of the stories they could have come up with.
Yeah, they could have utilized it in other places. I think the fact that this is a controlled situation makes a really big difference here, because in Trials and Tribble-ations, okay, it was just an accident. And at that point in time, they were just trying to find a way to do a 30th anniversary story. How do we get our crew back and mix them in with the original series? But there's this Orb of Time, that's fine. Has nothing really to do with Bajoran spirituality or anything else related to this series. But here it very, very much does. And the fact that, Kira's not setting coordinates per se, right? She's going and asking the prophets. And what probably happened is she opens it, and maybe not verbally, but she's letting the prophets into her mind, and she's communicating with them like, I'm wondering what happened with my mother. And it highlights the fact that for the prophets, time is not linear, right? So the prophets, if they choose to do so, can send you to any point in time that they want and show you what they want to show you. And that's what's happening here, because it does have to do with a Bajoran and with, a moment that could affect the course of that person's actions in the storyline, in the overall storyline of Deep Space Nine. And we've seen the prophets intervene in those cases, especially when they think Sisko is straying. Then they will intervene and give him visions, not through the Orb of Time, but just through... They have like the prophets and Sisko, they have like the red phone, between the White House and the Kremlin. Like the prophets feel like something's going on. They just pick up the red phone, and Sisko picks up the red phone, and then they all go to the like white cloudy place. Yeah, prophet phone, yeah.
But it's not red, it's white. Because everything
it's
they have...
white. It's totally white. Like prophets love white.
It makes Apple white look dingy. So...
Right. But the Apple store would feel right at home there in the wormhole, don't you think?
Actually, isn't that just an Apple store?
The prophets,
the prophet Apple
it's
store,
like the Genius Bar. They're geniuses, right?
Oh, the prophet Genius Bar. And what's
Sisko's
weird
like,
is
I've
they
got
all
this
just
problem with the wormhole. It's not working quite right. And the prophets are like, well, let me take it back and have a look.
What's weird, though, is that when you go to one of those prophet geniuses, they all look like somebody that you know. So it's like you're talking to your ex-wife or something. It's sometimes kind of awkward.
You're like, I never knew my third grade teacher knew so much about this. Yes, exactly. So if we look at other time travel in Deep Space Nine, here are the episodes, past tense. In past tense, they get thrown back because of chronoton particles building up on the ship's hull. In Visionary, Miles is exposed to some kind of radiation that throws him just slightly into the future. Then we have The Visitor, where some sort of discharge comes when they're trying to balance the warp engines, and it creates sort of a tether for Sisko going through time where he's not aging. But of course, we see the story not from a time travel perspective per se. We just see Jake when he's older. Little Green Men, something weird happens with the shuttle engines and they get thrown back in time. A Session, we have the wormhole at play here. So we have the person who thinks they're the emissary coming back through the wormhole. Trials and Tribble-ations, we talked about. Children of Time, that's another case where something happens with a field and the engines and they end up getting thrown into the past. Wrongs Darker Than Death or Night, we're already talking about. We have Time's Orphan, where Molly falls into a time portal. Okay, so don't put time portals in your caves, please. And then The Sound of Her Voice, which has to do with time displacement, once again, based on energy. So most of these, once again, are scientific explanations that don't get dwelled upon very much. Are there any of these where you think maybe the Orb of Time could have been a mechanism that they would have used?
It's interesting because, and the hard thing is you kind of just got to be near the Orb of Time to make it work, And so...
So it's kind of like Bluetooth.
Exactly. And so...
Do you have to pair yourself with the Orb of Time?
I do think you have to spend the night there so that you're in sync with it, so that when you walk in, you are in contact with the right prophet. So, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Got to check their schedule, right?
Yeah, exactly. They've got other things to do, Yeah. So, no, I think that Deep Space Nine, for the most part, does a pretty good job of creating good circumstances for time travel. And when they used the Orb of Time, it was definitely well done. I think that they could have written some very interesting stories to maybe use it once or twice in a character's life to do some pretty fascinating things that they just never tried. And maybe they had it as part of a thought process, but they never actually used. So, but yeah, I don't know. Like the problem is you don't have the pocket Orb of Time, that you get to carry around. So now that it's at a Bajoran monastery, you have to go to that monastery to have an experience with it. And so...
Yeah. I look at some stories like Past Tense is a story where I think that the Orb of Time could have come into play in the same way that it did in Trials and Tribble-ations to throw them back. And I look at something like Accession, for example. You could potentially see a story where a quorum line decides that he is displaced in time and he wants to get to the future because he's the emissary, and maybe he has access to the Orb of Time in what would be the past for our characters and brings himself forward into their time. I think that the key to it is that it has to be related. For it to really work, though, to make sense for the storytelling and not feel contrived, it has to be like what we see in Wrongs Darker Than Death or Night, where it involves Bajorans and it involves the spirituality. And people have to have physical access to it as well. I think of one other story that it's technically not a time travel story. I left it off the list there. Things Past, where we see Odo when he was security chief aboard Terok Nor under Gul Dukat. And they again have some sort of explanation about how there was some buildup of some particles and then changeling DNA in his brain still caused them to have this vision of the past. That's another situation where perhaps the Orb of Time could have made some sense in a different form of that story because the events took place on Terok Nor, and it's kind of within the realm of the Bajoran storyline and the prophets. But I think that it was smart that they did not turn to the Orb of Time very often because it would really weaken the power of that artifact within the Bajoran spirituality.
Yeah. No, I think that is a great point. And you do want to use it sparingly because it's not just a trinket to kind of be thrown around and played with. So if, for you, Chris, if there was something that you could have used it, how would you maybe have used it maybe once more? Is there an idea that's been floating around in your mind as we started talking about this idea that you're thinking, I really would have loved to have seen this happen?
Well, here's one idea, and I don't know if I really would want to see this happen because I like the mystery of DS9 where they leave a lot of stuff unsaid. But we've had this discussion a number of times here on the Orb about, did the prophets meet Sisko after he was stationed in the Bajoran system by Starfleet and realized that he was the vessel through which they could execute their plan? And then they went back in time, in terms of our linear time, and conceived him through the prophet that inhabited Sarah so that he would become their emissary, right? It's like retroactive on their part, changing history. If Sisko suspected that, Sisko could use the Orb of Time to go back and see the events that led up to his conception and see his conception. And I don't mean in a sexual way or anything. I just mean like the events that surrounded that through the eyes of the prophets, to find out, is it true? Like, was I created by the prophets for this specific purpose? You know, that's a kind of story that maybe could be told using the Orb of Time.
I like that. I think that would have been fascinating to kind of see play out and give him some sort of better understanding. And part of that, I think, goodness, wouldn't that have been an interesting thing to read in the books, you know, with Sisko being in the Celestial Temple as a thing that he would learn then, because he would be a person who's outside of space and time and therefore be able to know and to see that kind of thing happen. I wish we had explored more of that in that that arena, but that would have been an interesting thing to bring into the series to give him an even better understanding of who he is and where he came from and why.
Another one that, now this story actually takes place, but it's in a written story. You remember on Literary Treks years ago, we did that short story called Horn and Ivory. And Kira ends up way back in the past. I don't remember how many years now. I think it was a couple thousand years, right, in the past on Bajor. And that story explains why Bajor is called Bajor, why they call themselves the Bajorans. It explains a lot of the history of their religion and what their society was like prior to the Bajoran occupation. That's yet another case where they could have done that on the show and they could have used the Orb of Time. Maybe Kira, again, wanted to find out the truth about something about Bajoran religion or culture and used the Orb of Time to go back to that time period. And that's something on the show that would have filled in the mythology of the Bajorans a little bit more, which I think always helps the DS9 story.
Yeah, no, completely. I think that's another great addition there, and that I would have loved to have seen. And I mean, again, it's one of those things where you just want to be careful that you leave enough mystery, but at the same time,
thing, right?
You know, a little bit more explanation sometimes just adds more questions than it does answers, you know? So you could have just had some different but still very interesting questions left with both of those ideas. I really like that.
Do you have anything that you've thought of that would be a good use for the Orb of Time?
You know, I think it would have been really fascinating if Sisko had basically a It's a Wonderful Life with the Orb of Time, where for some reason or another, and it probably would have had to been a little bit earlier in the series, where Sisko is really rejecting his emissariness, and that he would get an opportunity to see what would happen if he didn't exist, and almost like in a way that he would see lots of examples that he would have already lived, but then almost get kind of like, quote unquote, a force vision where he would just see things that wouldn't make sense until later on in the series, but that he would be a part of. And I think that would have been to me, that's probably the most fascinating idea of seeing that play out, specifically with that character.
Yeah, that would be interesting as well. I'm curious, so everyone listening, if you have ideas on how the Orb of Time might have been used in a way that makes sense for it as an artifact of the Bajoran religion and the Bajoran culture, we'd love to hear that. So you can send us your thoughts on Twitter at Trek.fm or on Facebook in the Babel Conference. Those are two great places. Matthew, last thing to talk about on this topic. At the beginning, I mentioned that in Wrongs Darker Than Death or Night, Kira just opens the orb and suddenly she's there in the caves. And then at the end, she takes her mother and Dukat out of Dukat's quarters into the corridor. The bomb goes off And you're watching and you're thinking, this is what I'm thinking when it happens. They're going to question her. Who planted the bomb? It's going to be pretty clear that Nerys planted the bomb. What's going to happen to Nerys after that? But no, she's back in the monastery and she's back on Bajor, and the light from the Orb of Time is shining on her and it fades out. And that's where you really realize that these are orb visions. I'm not sure that the writers were very clear on how this actually worked, even in their own minds, however. When you open the Orb of Time, are you having a vision? Is this all playing out in your head? Is it a story being told to you, an interactive story? Choose your own adventure in space, being given to you by the prophets, or are you physically there? Can you affect the timeline? Because you wonder in Trials and Tribble-ations, can Sisko and the crew affect the timeline? You know, they have to make sure that things play out the way they do, or else history could be changed. Likewise here, if Kira had not saved her mother from the bomb, would Kira's life have changed because she and her siblings and her father would not have been taken care of anymore? I don't think they would have been executed because Maru didn't betray anything, unless they came up with a story that she's the one who bombed Dukat, but probably not. But they would not have been taken care of anymore as they were. So Kira's life should have changed as well if that had happened. So what do you think? I mean, using the Orb of Time, can you change the timeline? Should you be able to change the timeline?
For me, I never actually even thought about this question because I think I felt like that the prophets can control what type of experience you're having. And I feel like, so the first time that we use the Orb of Time, it is time travel as we kind of know it in Star Trek, mainly because it's not controlled. It was an accident, and I guess almost maybe even the prophets allowing them to go back and experience something special.
The prophets were not involved in that. Like, the prophets didn't send them
right.
to Space Station K7, right?
Right, which is, it's a weird thought that would happen.
Because the prophets don't even know about. Prophets are like tribbles. What are tribbles?
Yeah.
What is this tribble?
Maybe they just really wanted to celebrate the 30th anniversary of that thing called Star Trek. And
the prophets wanted to celebrate
exactly.
the 30th.
And that was their way of doing it. And so I think, though, this specifically with Kira is very specific type of time travel for her, in the sense that she really is experiencing these things with her mother. I think that if you could talk to Maru, she would remember this woman. And yet, at the same time, I also feel like I think she really is back in time experiencing things. But I don't know that if you asked her mother that she would have ever met this person. I think they're placing her in the situation as it was, and as her mother was, as Dukat was, as everything was, and yet allowing this character to be there. But it's not actually affecting the timeline, it's only affecting Nerys. Does that make sense?
Okay.
Like, it's not. It's almost like it almost is like an orb experience.
Yeah.
But a very special type of orb experience that allows you to be able to interact with somebody from the past, but not in the same way we saw in Trials and Tribble-ations. This is a much more controlled.
Yeah. So I guess my question is, if the bomb had gone off and she had killed her mother and Dukat, would that have changed history for her in any way? Or would the prophets have let that happen, but because they can control the timeline, it would not actually have any impact on anything?
I don't think it would have had any impact on anything, because I think this is more about Kira than it is about her mother. And
because remember, Dukat would have died.
Right.
As well.
Right. So I don't think, I really do think this is more about Kira understanding herself through all of this than really, and learning about her mother than any other aspect. So no, I don't think Kira would all of a sudden fade from all of her pictures, like, in Back to the Future.
Well, Kira wouldn't disappear because she was already alive, but her life would have changed because, as I was saying a moment ago, her family would not have received extra rations, or, her father actually says in that message to her mother that they've been back home, in fact. So this, for me, it's kind of similar to Things Past in a way. Now, in Things Past, Odo is the focus of that episode, but Odo appears to others to be a Bajoran. But we see him as normal Odo for the sake of the storytelling, but the purpose of the story is for him to witness events that have influenced his life and to have a better understanding of those events. And I often wonder if the events of Things Past, if that was not a vision given to him by the founders, as opposed to just being some kind of weird, scientific shared experience thing. Just like here, this is a vision being given to Kira by the prophets. She's physically there, she's interacting with people, just like Odo was physically there, physically interacting with people, even though he was in the body of a Bajoran to everyone who was looking at him. So there are some similarities in those two stories, but the mechanism is quite different. But in Things Past, it's very clear that nothing that happens there can affect the timeline, right? It's like watching a videotape of what happened. It's happened. You're not there being able to change events. Whereas in this story, it's presented to us as if Kira is there. And, we were joking at the beginning of, is this now? Did this already happen? Has this happened? Yeah, we're presented in this Orb of Time experience as if the future hasn't happened yet, and therefore it could be influenced.
Yeah, I guess I've never read the episode like that. I've always read it as just more of an experience she gets to have, but not one that actually has it could have any impact on the timeline, because she says before to Sisko, the prophets aren't going to let me do anything that's going to, they're going to. So I always took that to mean that I'm getting to experience history, but I can't frack it up because the prophets are in control at this point. So,
well, and that's how I read the episode as well, and I think that is the case. But it does raise the question, because there's always so much concern about changing the timeline. Yeah. And I think that the writers did not really present it very clearly, how the Orb of Time works in terms of changing the timeline.
Right. And I think that was one of almost the genius moves for it, was because you have the prophets who are behind this, they're outside of time and space, and their mystical orb can have lots of different properties to it, and you just chalk it up to, super beings. Which is sometimes bad writing, but I think because they use it so sparingly, it works.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. But let us know what you think if you're listening. Again, you can find us on Twitter. Our username is Trek.fm. You can find us on Facebook in the Babel Conference. Just type Babel, B-A-B-E-L, into the search field, and it'll come right on up. You can also send us an email through our website. Go to Trek.fm/contact. Choose the form, choose to send to a show, and choose the orb, and that'll come to both Matthew and me. You can also send us a voicemail at speakpipe.com/TrekFM. Well, the Orb of Time isn't the only thing we've been discussing here on the network recently, so here's a quick look at some of our other shows.
Previously on Trek.fm, The Ready Room.
Please sit down, let me get my eel.
Yeah, right. It just slapped. See, now that would have been awesome if he had just slapped the eel in Archer's face, and then Archer, that entire meaningful scene at the end of the episode, the discussion between Archer and T'Pol, if he had a giant eel stuck to his cheek the whole time.
The Orb.
And what's so great, I think, about Star Trek Deep Space Nine is, especially with Sisko, is you get to watch somebody slowly become a believer in a faith, and it's shown as being reasonable.
Literary Treks.
The big difference is when you're doing nonfiction books, the way we do them, we do a lot of interviewing, and the interviewing requires a lot of transcribing tapes, and that's possibly the most miserable job one could ever run into. It's a real task.
And that's what else is happening on Trek.fm.
So check out all of these shows and find out what we're talking about in your favorite corner of the Star Trek universe. We have shows covering every single aspect of Star Trek and beyond, and you can find them everywhere that you get podcasts. The two main places are iTunes. Go to itunes.com/TrekFM. That'll take you to our artist section. We are a featured content provider with Apple there in the iTunes store. And you can also find us on Android in the Google Play app. Just look at your Google Play Music app and search Trek FM, search the Orb. We should come right on up. Again, all the other podcast outlets, you're going to find us there as well. You can also stream and download from the website. So go check out everything that we're discussing every single day here on the network. And if you want to help us keep that discussion going, we could use your help. We are a listener-supported network. So go to patreon.com/TrekFM. That's patreon.com/TrekFM. Everything that you need to know about how to contribute to the network is there, as well as the perks that we have for you. We have a lot of great things and a great way for you to be involved in the network. Again, patreon.com/TrekFM is that URL. I'd also like to take a quick moment and thank our associate producers here on The Orb, Ruth Ward, Ken Tripp, William Murray, and K. Elizabeth Janeway. It's thanks to the help that we get from Ruth, Ken, Kay, and William that we're able to put the show together and put together all the other shows here on the network as well. You can become an associate producer if you would like to by going to patreon.com/TrekFM. You'll get all the information on that over there. And thank you once again, Ruth, Ken, William, and Kay, for all of your support. Now, Matthew, when you're not, hanging out with the Orb of Time, so you can go back and maybe see if you can help George Lucas put together Star Wars or help J.K. Rowling put together Harry Potter, all your favorite loves, where can people find you?
Well, goodness, when I'm not doing that, which takes up a lot of time, you can find me on Twitter at MattRushing02. I'm also here on the network doing Literary Treks with Dan and Bruce, talking about the books and the comics of Star Trek, of course, interviewing the authors about their latest work, and doing the 602 Club, the General Geek Show, talking about all of our favorite fandoms and geekdoms and everything else that doesn't have to do with Star Trek, which is a blast, so check that out. And I also host a podcast with John Mills talking about Star Wars called Aggressive Negotiations. You can find that, of course, on iTunes under Aggressive Negotiations. Now, Chris, when you're not worried about what time it is because you're late again, just like the White Rabbit, where can we find you?
That's the first thing that popped into my mind was the White Rabbit, Matthew. Yes, absolutely. And then I had this vision of Troy, Riker, and the White Rabbit drinking together, and Troy explaining to the White Rabbit that they just don't have the time.
They don't. They really don't.
It's sort of a First Contact Shore Leave mashup, Matthew.
I love it. We should have definitely gotten that.
So when I'm not doing that, you can find me elsewhere on the network on The Ready Room. That's my show where we talk about all 5 live-action Star Trek series, and we rotate through those. We also have other special topics from time to time, and we have a news segment. And you can find my writing about Star Trek over on the official website at StarTrek.com. Just search for my name, C. Bryan Jones, to find my articles on there. And then you can find me on Twitter. My username is C. Bryan Jones. That's also my name on Facebook, pretty much everywhere in social media. And you'll find me there in the Babel Conference as well, talking about Star Trek with our wonderful audience. One more thing I would like to remind you about before we go is the Trek.fm store on Redbubble. We have fantastic designs by our art director, Aaron Harvey, over there. They're available on t-shirts and other types of apparel, as well as mugs and notebooks and iPad and iPhone cases and all kinds of stuff. And you can find it by going to Trek.fm.store. Trek.fm.store. That's a great way to help us out here on the network and help us keep everything going, because we do make a little bit of money when we sell stuff there. Most of it goes to production, but we get a little bit, and that helps us cover the cost of production, hosting, distribution, everything that it takes to get our podcasts out there to you. So together with patreon.com, that is a wonderful way for you to help us keep the Orb going and help us keep all of our shows going here on the network. And we really thank everyone who's supporting us there right now.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you next time as we gaze into the Orb.
Recording. Are we recording now, or in the past, or in the future?
So what's happening now?
What happened a minute ago?
So what's happening now is what's happening now?
Right now.
But what happened then?
That's right. Then is now.
What about...
Are you trying to remember the whole scene in Spaceballs?
Yes. It's such a great
They get
scene.
out the videotape.
Yes. So what's happening now? What's happening now is happening now. But what just happened? That was then. This is now. It's such a great scene.
Oh, that was so awesome back at the time when that movie came out, that they would get out the video and watch the movie. But the movie isn't finished yet, because they hit static at one point, right?
Yes, yep.
This is now.
Oh, gosh.
This hasn't happened yet.
Where's my coffee? Everybody knows I like my coffee when I'm watching my radar. Mr. Coffee, Mr. Radar.
Mr. Coffee and Mr. Radar. Yeah.
Oh, man. What a great movie.
Right.
Which is funny because
it
when
really is.
we talked about the new Independence Day, we actually named it The Search for More Money.
Oh, I remember that. Yeah.